Now, I've read a few Batman runs, but I've never had one that's made me do a complete 180 in my opinion. But that was until I read this book. Woof woof! Hey guys, it's me Marcus, aka the Mad Dog, and we're back with another video. Written by James Tynion Episode 4 and New Hope, and illustrated by a handful of artists, including Eddie Barrows at the beginning. Tynion took over Detective Comics at issue 934 in August of 2016, with his last main issue being in July of 2018, with issue number 981. And Batman's taken the decision to build a team. With Batwoman by his side, he recruits Red Robin, Orphan, Spoiler, and Clayface. And this volatile dynamic is immediately thrown into the deep end as an army of Batman-like soldiers are coming after the entire team. And that's just the start of the gauntlet that this team has to go through, as they've got the Villain Syndicate, the League of Shadows, the return of OMAC, and what I can only describe as a Terminator-like Batman that's been sent from the future to kill one of the Gotham Knights' strongest members. But when an impossible choice forces one of the members to break Batman's ultimate rule, how can the team and Gotham itself manage to survive? Now I'm going to have to start this review on a bit of a negative point because the art does vary quite wildly depending on who was doing it. But one thing that was consistent in this omnibus and a hindrance to the book itself was the panelling. There'd be some pages in this book that didn't look like double page spreads, especially because of where the gutter lined up with it, that actually were, so I found myself reading the panels in the wrong order, which feels a bit dumb to say, but I feel like I can't be the only person who's had that issue with this book. It is also a bit of an issue with the omnibus itself because of the fact that the spine is quite tight and there is a bit of gutter loss. So some of those panels that do merge into the other page, maybe I just couldn't see them as well as I probably should have done. But then the problem is, because this happened on a couple of occasions, I ended up second guessing myself on the things that were actually single pages. It was just weird that this seemed to be a theme that went across all the artists, it wasn't just specific to one of them. So who knows, maybe I'm just bad at reading comics and I've wasted like the last 15 years of my life. But Eddie Barrows was my favourite of the artists that was featured in this. I enjoyed his work from when I first saw him working on Nightwing during the New 52, which, yes, of course, is my jam. And he was even better here. I like that I could see the progression from where he was in 2011. In particular, he worked really well with the group dynamic. He always made sure that everybody got a bit of attention, and his action was vibrant and dynamic, and even when characters were just having conversations, he found a way to make them engaging. But the rest of the art never really lived up to the tone that was set by Barrows. I did really like that Clayface issue, especially because of the layout of the panels and just the tone that it had throughout. And admittedly, because of the fact that this book doesn't really have a glossary, that could have been Eddie Barrows and I just don't know. Another artist that I did like was the one during the League of Shadows story arc. I think it was Kristen Deuce. And let's just get this out of the way, I'm not sure if I'm saying his name right, I'm not sure if I'm saying James Tynion right. Pronunciation of names along with being able to figure out how panels work is clearly not my strong suit. But Christian's style was enough like Barrows that I didn't feel like it was a massive jarring change. He was also the artist that gave me the least trouble with the panels and the double page spreads, so I really hope that I can see him do some work again in future. But the problem is, when there's so many different artists that are coming in and out of this book, and it seems to be happening between issues, it doesn't really have a lot of consistency. Sometimes it felt like an artist was trying to imitate what had come before it, and then you had others that just did a complete 180. However, the designs of the characters were consistent throughout, which sometimes can be a thing that just changes with the artist. So if anything, I am just glad that there wasn't a massive radical redesign between issues. And I do understand that obviously there was a lot of issues that came out in a short period of time, and it wouldn't have been possible for one artist to probably do that, unless it was somebody like Mark Bagley, who I recently spoke about in my Ultimate Spider-Man video. But I do have to give credit where it's due, because nearly 50 issues of this title was released in pretty much a 2-year span. And if I was to dive into it a little bit further, I think I could probably find at least something that I liked about each artist. And some of those different storylines did need a little bit of a different tone, so it did help out in some circumstances. I just felt like there wasn't really much rhyme or reason to who the artists were and why they kept getting changed out, besides the fact that they probably needed it for the schedule. But you can check out if you like the art for itself by picking this book up from the channel sponsor, Organic Price Books. They've got great packaging, fast shipping, and amazing customer services, and if you use code WOOFWOOF, you'll get $2 off your order. And if you're ordering 3 or more books and you want them to be delivered together, make sure you use code WOOFWOOF, ship it together for 5% off your entire order. Don't worry, you can just copy and paste them from the description down below, and you can use these codes as many times as you like. Now, diving into the story part of this review, I wasn't really a massive fan of this book from the first story arc. Now, don't get me wrong, I enjoyed the Rise of the Batmen story arc, and it was great seeing how this team got introduced to each other, the dynamic that they had together, learning to work together, and also accepting Clayface as a member of the team. But the problem was that the colony and their plan reminded me so much of the Arkham Knight game, and that was released a full year before Tynion even started on this title. And yes, I know even though his first issue came out in 2016, he was probably doing work for this title before that. This book seemed to have quite a bit of hype behind it, and it just felt like it wasn't really doing enough to be anything special yet. And it's a shame because there were glimpses of greatness early on. There was one moment that was really emotional emotional and powerful, and I thought it was really going to set the tone for the rest of the book. But then they just completely reversed it. There was absolutely no time to try and digest what had happened before they'd already said they didn't matter. Like, to give you a spoiler-free example, imagine if I was sat here now and saying that this is going to be my last ever video on YouTube. I'm just speaking hypothetically, don't get too excited, but it's all sad, the music changes, maybe I've even put it in black and white, but then by the end it's all back to normal and I'm talking about what video I'm going to do next. There was a similar situation when I reviewed Batman and Robin by Tomasi and Gleason, and I felt like with the similar situation it was handled better in the Batman and Robin title, but that's something that I'm going to have to elaborate on in the spoiler section. And unfortunately the book's second arc was even worse. And no, I'm not talking about the Victims Syndicate, because I felt like that was where the book really started to gain some momentum again, but that crossover between Detective Comics, Nightwing and Batman was just awful. I hated this story arc, and even though I'm somebody who's a bit of a completionist and I hate when an omnibus leaves out issues, in hindsight I would have been perfectly comfortable with them leaving this out of this book. I don't really think it was massively integral to the rest of the series, and it was just so drawn out and evidence to what I, even as an event apologist, don't like about events the most. This was a 2-issue mini arc that was drawn out for 6 across 3 different titles, and it didn't even follow the tone of the rest of the book. It felt like such an anomaly to be in here. Yes, sure, there are some minor references to Monster City, but if you don't know that, you're still fine. You just think it's a different part of Gotham. Gotham has a street that's known as Crime Alley, so if somebody told me that there was a part of this city just called Monster Town, I'd just accept it. I don't need to know the story behind that, and especially when this is a story that caused it. And just to give it the benefit of the doubt, I haven't read all of King's Batman run, so it might feel better suited to be in there. At least I hope it would be. But I honestly would have skipped these issues if I wasn't doing a review, and if you're reading this book or you're planning to read it, and you're not really feeling it after the first issue, by all means still give it a go. It might be something for you. But if that is the case, feel free to skip them and just carry on with the rest of the book. However, after this book gets over some of those initial speed bumps, it just goes from strength to strength. However, after this book gets over some of its initial speed bumps, it just goes from strength to strength. However, after this book gets over its initial speed bump, it just goes from strength to strength. The Victims Syndicate was a really interesting concept, and it was executed well. And I like that each hero in the Gotham Knights had their own villain to go up against. And it built really well to this climax at Arkham that I just really enjoyed, and it was where I started to realise that I was really enjoying this book. My only real criticism of it was that we were learning about each of these new villains, and they all had a backstory that connected some way to a member of this team, but every hero that was connected to him just forgot this completely massive event that happened. It is a problem when you're introducing new villains, so I give it a bit of the benefit of the doubt, and considering how interesting and enjoyable these new characters were, I'm willing to let that slide. This was also the arc that proved why Clayface was a great addition to this title, and what he did for his character was astonishing, because I always just thought of him as some kind of like C or D list villain, and I'm not afraid to admit this, but I rolled my eyes when he was first introduced into this team. I thought it was just going to be some kind of gimmick that would only last for a couple of issues and it wouldn't really matter in the long run, but by the end of this book I was so glad that he was included. And honestly, he was probably one of my 3 favourite characters in this run, and there was an issue in particular that just focused on him and his origin story, and I can honestly say that that was one of the highlights of this entire omnibus. And it just showed why Clayface is this deeper, more intriguing character, and it made me feel bad for just considering him to be C or D list. He was far more complex, and I kind of feel a bit bad that I read this before I do my Batman tier list video, because now I'm probably going to have to put Clayface somewhere that I wouldn't have done originally. We then have the story arc with the League of Shadows, which I really enjoyed. I like that there was rumblings and rumours about them that we then saw come into fruition, and I just wish that there could have been a bit more of a parallel drawn between Batwoman and her father issues that she was having, and Batman's and the ones that he has with Raish. However, even though I really enjoyed this arc, it was where I was starting to get a bit annoyed at the fact that the leader of the colony was still cropping up in this book. But it's a problem that I had with this book overall, that he didn't know which bits to leave in and which ones it should leave behind. And don't get me wrong, by the end it paid off a little bit because it all came together, but as I was going through this book, and it is pretty long, so I did get the feeling like this was going to be something that wouldn't really turn itself around, but I found myself wishing that they would have left some of the characters back until they actually needed them again. This arc was also the one that really made me like Orphan being in this team. I liked Cassandra when she was Batgirl, I was introduced to her through No Man's Land, and I haven't really seen her a lot of times since then. Her origin story also fascinated me as well. It was the one that I enjoyed speaking about the most when I did my video on Who is the Bat Family, and I loved that this run really gave her a chance to become part of a family and show how much this team meant to her, and especially the relationship that they built between her and Clayface. And although these two weren't the centre of the entire book, I felt that their relationship was what really elevated it. Azrael and Batwing also became more prominent features in this book from this story arc, and I do wish that we would have got some more time with them, especially before this team entered the full part of this omnibus, because those are two great characters and I felt like they were just kind of like in a supporting role. And from this point on, I'm going to get even more vague with my review because of the fact that I don't want to spoil too much. And the story arc after the League was a ton of fun as well. There was this surprise inclusion of a member of the DC universe that on paper, when you think about it, probably shouldn't sound great, but it was. However, my problem with this arc, because it was delved in magic and stuff like that, it was just very MacGuffin heavy. The entire storyline was built around things that Batman or his enemy needed to get, and it was pretty much just a race for this thing that we're just told is important, but we don't really have any understanding of why. And it was here as well that I found myself getting particularly frustrated with a certain member, or maybe former member is a better way to phrase it. And sure, yes, I anticipated that there was going to be some conflict between Batman and the other members of the team that he'd assembled, but at this certain point, I felt like the one that had gone against the team felt more like a nuisance than an actual situation. At this point in the omnibus, I found myself thinking that this is fun, but nothing really special, until we reached the story arc, A Lonely Place of Living. I don't know what happened with Tynion to make him just say fuck it and go absolutely batshit crazy and incorporate some kind of time-traveling Terminator-like storyline with the Bat family, but thank God he did. Pretty much every single issue after this point bested the one that came before it. And a lot of those criticisms that I had earlier on, like some of the characters just seeming to linger around, actually became a strength of this book. It was complex, tense, it made me question what I thought and knew about these characters while still making me enjoy what was happening. I couldn't put the book down at this point, and I can't really say too much more because I don't want to spoil it because of how enjoyable it was. And honestly, it's worth checking out this book just for how great the second half of it is, because you then have the fall of the Batman story arc and it carries that same momentum. It also felt like a natural progression of the previous storyline. It didn't feel like it had just gone, yeah, we're done with that crazy Terminator Batman, now we're just going to go on to the next thing. But because of that crazy Terminator like Batman, we get crazy Terminator like Batman 2 Judgment Day, and it was one of those car crash like moments where you knew it wasn't going to end happily, but you still couldn't look away. The inevitable climax that it felt like Tynion had been building up from issue 1 was like being on a runaway mine train that I just couldn't jump off of. I knew there was two possible outcomes, both of which would have been detrimental to the team, but I still couldn't stop reading this. It was such a good time. It's surprising, but this book also does have a fairly clean conclusion considering everything that happens within it, and especially because of how it juggled so many of its previous villains and the length of the book. And it was only when I was closing it that I realised they didn't rely that heavily on a lot of Batman's rogues gallery. Sure, yes, there was Ra's al Ghul in the League, but you didn't really see the Joker cropping up, or Two-Face, or a lot of the Penguin. And I don't know, I'm not really good at knowing the timelines off the top of my head, so maybe they were caught up in some kind of other title. But Tynion managed to create a thoroughly entertaining book without needing to rely on all the villains that had already been established. He managed to create his own, and I'd love to see the Victims Syndicate crop up again, and I'd also like to just see the Batman from Lonely Place of Living just exist in the DC universe now. And although this is a point of praise, I do think it would have been interesting to see how this team would have worked against some of those more established Batman villains. But considering that we live in a time where an appearance from the Joker or Harley Quinn is more common than a new #1 issue, I'm impressed and give credit to Tynion because of the fact that he went in the direction that he did. We're getting into the spoiler section now, and no, I'm not just talking about the character, but if you don't want anything about this book ruined, I'd recommend skipping to the final verdict timestamp down below. And this is your final spoiler warning, because I feel like Tim's death would have been much more impactful if it would have lasted for at least one issue. This is honestly the biggest blunder of this book for me, because I don't understand why they had to make it that you knew that Tim was still alive when most of the characters hadn't even grieved for him. Especially with it being so early on in the book, it just felt like they didn't have the confidence to execute that plan without maybe pissing off too many fans. And it's even more baffling because of the fact that we know that death in comics is a complete joke. We know that eventually Tim would come back in some capacity, so I just don't understand why they had to make it within the same issue that you knew that he was still alive. It also sort of diminished some of those moments that the other characters had in the reaction to it, especially people like Spoiler, and maybe that's why I was a bit harsh on it and didn't really appreciate her entire crusade, because it all felt a bit futile because of the fact that we knew that Tim was still alive. But honestly, just whilst I'm talking about it, Spoiler did piss me off pretty much throughout this entire book. The worst part is that she did have valid motivations motivations to turn against Batman. But it just felt like they kept making situations where Batman would need to turn to Stephanie, despite the fact that he's made this entire team. He knows countless other heroes, he also knows the Justice League. But yeah, of course, Stephanie must be the only person on the planet that can help him with a problem. And what could have been a genuine conflict between these two characters often just felt like Stephanie doing whatever she could to hinder Batman, because it felt like she spent longer trying to get in Batman's way and try and ruin things for him than she did fighting crime. And the worst part is that I liked Stephanie when she was Batgirl, and I know that there's other people that like this character, and maybe you like the way that she was portrayed in this book, but I just didn't. I also felt like Batman just brushed it under the carpet really easily once he realised that Tim was still alive. Stephanie was a bit more hesitant to jump back into the team, but it was just funny that Bruce seemed to have this all is forgiven attitude, considering the fact that she caused quite a lot of shit. But in saying that, Zatanna's storyline was really fun, and that was the character that I couldn't really talk about earlier, because it was a nice inclusion. She's one of those characters that I really like when I do see it in a book. There's never been a time that I haven't enjoyed it, but if I don't see it in a couple of titles, I tend to forget that she exists. I really wish DC would do something with Zatanna's series that was written by Paul Dini, but it's books like this that remind me why I like that series in the first place. It left me wanting to see more of her working with Batman, which is a much better situation to be in than the one with Spoiler and Colonel Kane, where I just wish that they weren't in it that often. It just would have been fun that in a team with this dynamic where most of the characters come from a slightly different background, if they would have had someone that was based in magic. And it would have given my dumbass more of a chance to finally figure out how to read her spells. But like I said, I also found myself wishing that Colonel Kane was in less of this book. It was an interesting dynamic with her being Batwoman's father and also the guy that was trying to get rid of the team, but the scenes after that first story arc where he'd been detained in the Batcave just kind of felt like Obi-Wan's Force Ghost moments, and it just dragged a bit, especially in the story arcs where I just wanted to focus on the main plot. When he did eventually escape and factor into the main storyline a bit more, I did really enjoy this character again, but I think it would have been more impactful if we just hadn't have seen him throughout the rest of the book. It should have been clear in the non-spoiler part, but I really enjoyed the last few story arcs. Lonely Place of Living was the shot of adrenaline that this book needed, and it was just so great seeing a crazy Tim Drake Batman trying to kill Batwoman. If it would have set with the same tone and pace that it had for the arcs before this, it still would have been enjoyable, but I think I probably would have felt a bit burnt out. I liked in particular at first that it made me question if this was real or if it was just another trick by Ulysses. And it was also the best kind of, it's a character that you know but they're evil and from the future kind of storyline, because of the fact that at first you don't understand how Tim could become that person, but the more you learn about him, the more of an inevitability that it feels. And this was a villain that I was really happy to see reappear after his initial story arc had finished, and especially as we learned the full story of why Batwoman did end up killing Bruce, and the fact that Tim's motivations weren't really that noble. But Batwoman shooting Clayface, this was the moment that solidified that this is a damn good book. And I can't even put my finger on the main reason why. Is it because of the fact that I just didn't want it to happen? Is it the fact that I now care about Clayface? Is it the fact that I don't want to see Batwoman going up against the team? Or is it some kind of combination of all of that and more? It's going to be the last one. And you saw all the steps in the build up to this happening, and it just felt so tense and you couldn't look away even though you knew that this was going to be the conclusion. And it's just so weird that I started this book by wondering why Clayface was in it and thinking it was just going to be some gimmick that I didn't enjoy, to then being a bit conflicted when he was killed at the end. And yeah, I know that they kind of had that tease at the end that he is still okay, but in the moment, this really mattered. This is my final verdict, and Batman is a tricky character to write a new concept for. If you change too much, you'll lose what made the character in the first place and alienate the fans that brought the character to prominence. But if you keep things the same, there's probably already been a comic that's tackled the same idea. At first, this omnibus, The Rise and Fall of the Batman, seemed like it was trying to do both. It wanted to have Batman assemble his own team and work well within them and kind of bring up the next generation of heroes, but at the same time they were going against an enemy that was pretty much everything that we'd seen in the Arkham Knight. What this book did was more impressive than just giving us an original and faithful take on the Dark Knight and his family, and it gave me an over 1,000 page epic that just got better with every single issue. And I think this book sells itself short by calling it a Batman title because it's all about the Bat family, and it should be proud to say Detective Comics here instead of selling itself short as just another title about the Dark Knight. Sure, yes, this isn't my favourite Batman run, and it might not even be my favourite that I've reviewed on this channel, but it's one that I would gladly go back to again, albeit I'd probably start at the middle just to save a bit of time. It has a great amount of heart, an interesting premise, and unforgettable moments. So much so that I can look past the inconsistencies in the art, and also with the proofreading, because honestly there were so many spelling and grammar mistakes in this book that I thought they was checked by Matt Murdock. And those opening story arcs weren't really a fair reflection of just how good this book would be. And everything built to this satisfying conclusion that made what had come before it worthwhile. Those slow story arcs or the moments where it felt like it was just treading water was all just build up so that we could see the Bat family at the best and also at the worst. So I'd recommend this to anybody who is looking for a bit of a different Batman storyline and maybe has the time to eke it out to the 4th story arc so that you can get one of the best reading experiences that I've had with the Bat family in a good number of years. And because of that, I'm going to give this a very respectable score of 75%. Woof woof! So that's my review, and if you've checked out this book, let me know what you think about it in the comment section below. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up, and if you didn't, why did you get this far? I guess that's the video, and until next time, just make sure that you stay safe, and stay mad all you dogs. Woof woof! See you in the next video.